born, which was 1962, neither of them would have even heard of the term Formula One. They shouldn't be exposed to that kind of terminology being used in that kind of way. In some ways, the person who's most surprised about that is the person themselves. He doesn't need money, so he doesn't need to earn money at the moment or ever. We spoke to Aston Martin, Alpine, and Red Bull in that way, and they have said yes. And by the way, those teams aren't doing very badly at the moment, are they? I will have to take a holiday from Twitter for another 2 months while the furore dies down of me having insulted a driver.
Welcome to Stripping the Dipping. Today we have a very, very special episode for Pride Month, but it would be special any time of year. We have the legendary English journalist, author, and former communications director and public relations executive for the McLaren and Aston Martin F1 teams, Matt Bishop. Welcome to Stripping the Dipping.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Lovely. I'm a big fan, actually. Been for a couple of years now, ever since I got into F1. Catch us up on how everything's going. What are you up to these days?
Well, I finished up at Aston Martin at the end of last year. I mean, Seb Vettel and I worked very closely together, and he retired as a Formula One driver, and I stepped away from Aston Martin at that time. At the moment, I'm basically doing 3 things. I'm writing a weekly column for motorsportmagazine.com, and I do a column every week, and it comes out on a Tuesday morning, and I can basically write about what I want to write about. But what I choose to write about is always, or almost always, I find a modern topical peg and then write a column that contextualizes that modern topical peg probably into the history of motor racing in some way. And I've done it for the last couple of months. It's only new. And there you are, motorsportmagazine.com if you want to go and have a look. Secondly, what I do is I do some corporate public speaking. It doesn't always get seen because sometimes I go along and speak to a company and its C-suite executives and talk to them about various things. Sometimes it appears on that company's intranet. Sometimes it's just behind closed doors, giving them some advice and perhaps drawing interesting insights and parallels, or at least I hope they're interesting, in their business, drawing on the lessons that can be learned around Formula One, which is such a remarkable business in so many ways. And also talking about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in sport and indeed business, including but not solely restricted to LGBTQ plus equity and equality. And the third thing I do is I do a little bit of freelance comms, PR, marketing and consultancy work. So those 3 things I suppose I do. And that keeps me busy. I'm 60 years old, but I don't want to retire, and I'm actually pretty busy. And somebody told me the other day, that's a portfolio career. And I thought, yeah, portfolio career, I'll settle for that. And I'm quite enjoying my portfolio career.
That's brilliant. It's very interesting to see that, to see your journey from journalist to working in F1 and then sort of back to journalism, I'm guessing more evolved in a way. And wiser. So let's talk about your beginnings. Like, how did you get into motorsports to begin with? Who were your heroes growing up, and what did you most like about F1, both in the past and today?
Do you mean as a kid when I first fell in love with it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I came from a family that knew nothing of and had no enthusiasm for motorsport. My dad was a classical, or is, I should say, a classical pianist. He didn't mind and doesn't mind cars, road cars, but has absolutely no interest in Formula One. My mother, who's sadly no longer with us, she died 10 years ago, she was a author, but also a teacher and a psychotherapist. But she never had even the faintest interest in motor racing. I genuinely would say that when I was born, which was 1962, neither of them would have even heard of the term Formula One. Neither of them would have even heard of it. It would be completely foreign to them. Of course, Formula One was much less of a big thing then than it is now. But because I wasn't brought up by people who knew anything about it, or motorsport in general, I suppose I had to discover it on my own. I liked cars. I was one of these nerdy kids that would walk down the street calling out the names of all the cars. Even when I was 2 or 3, I knew the difference between a Ford Cortina and a Morris Oxford. And obviously rather dates me, the fact that those are the brand names I call out. But there, you understand me. Anyway, when I was about 10, which would have been in 1972, so I'd have been about 9.5 because it was the summer. And I walked into the newsagent's shop in London. I've always lived in London, and saw a magazine, and it was called Autosport. And on the cover was a blue car that I thought was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I now know it was Jackie Stewart's Tyrrell, but I didn't know what it was then. I just thought it was a beautiful thing. And I said to the newsagent, "What's that, Autosport?" He said, "Yeah, that's motor racing." And I was, my mum had given me a subscription, a weekly subscription to a football magazine called Shoot. And that's what I'd gone into the newsagents to collect. I said, "Can I cancel Shoot and have Autosport?" He said, "Of course you can, son." So I did that. I took it home. I read it from cover to cover. And honestly, it was an epiphany for me because I realized that this was I loved sport already. I loved football. I loved cricket as a kid. And the idea that my two passions, which were cars and sport, could be combined was completely new to me. And I thought this sport must have been invented for me only and that nobody else would be interested in it. But I was wrong about that, of course. So that was how I fell in love with the sport, and I began to read Autosport. You have to remember that Formula One wasn't on television in the UK in 1972. The British Grand Prix might be highlights. Monaco just might be highlights. But your normal race, your Brazilian Grand Prix, your United States Grand Prix, no, wouldn't be on the television. Wouldn't even be reported in the Monday's papers. You had to wait till the weekly magazines such as Autosport, Autocar, Motoring News, which is what Motorsport News was then called. So it was a really small, tiny sport, but I fell in love with it.
That's brilliant. I grew up in the 90s, so of course it was on TV, but I can't imagine not knowing exactly what happened turn by turn, lap by lap. Well, you've made a very successful career, not only from journalism, but also as an author and working at historic teams such as McLaren and recently at Aston Martin. Where did the journey begin and how did these opportunities come about? And of course, what was the transition like from being a fan to actually being in the sport?
I'm an incredibly lucky man, and I've always, had lucky things that would happen to me that have helped me on my way. I never consider myself in any way a talented person, but very much a lucky person. And I didn't do very well in school. I mean, I was seen as a clever boy, I guess. And in my first, when I was 12, 13, 14, I was doing very well in exams. But when I got to about 15, 16, I kind of gave up. Just couldn't be bothered with schoolwork. By the way, if any youngsters are listening to this, please do not do as I do. Please do as I say, which is go and study, and don't listen to me. But I was a bit of a lazy boy from about 14, 15, 16, and I didn't do awfully well in my exams. So at that point, what then did I do? Well, I started doing all sorts of not particularly remunerative or not particularly respectable jobs, and such as, I worked as an unlicensed minicab driver in London. I sold jewelry on market stalls. I worked in a dairy factory, all sorts of things. And one of the things I did was I worked at greyhound racing tracks, which was quite a big thing in London, particularly, but in the UK as well at that time. Now, of course, it isn't. But it was then. I mean, London was full of greyhound racing tracks. At about 10. Now it has none. And I was worked as a bookie's assistant, a bookmaker's assistant, and I began to talk to some of the regular greyhound racing fraternity at the tracks, and they said, "You can talk, you can express yourself." And a man called Jim Cremin, who worked for the Racing Post then and still now, by the way, and still now, he said to me, "Write a couple of things for me," and I did, and people seemed to like them. And then I began to do sub-editing for the Racing Post. Sub-editing meaning checking the grammar, cutting to fit, writing the headlines, stand first captions, all that. And that was prior to the computer age and the digital age. That was there was a lot more to that. It was a labor-intensive role, and every newspaper and magazine had a sub-editor. Now most of them don't, but after that, I had the skill of sub-editing, and I was always literate and always quite pernickety around making sure that things were correct. And that's what a sub needs to be, a sub-editor needs to be. And I applied for a job on Car Magazine, not the most imaginatively entitled magazine, but it's very clear what it's about. And I applied for a job as a sub-editor on Car Magazine and got it. And by the time, we're now fast forward to about 1990 odd. So I was in my late 20s, and I got that job. It was mostly about road cars, production cars, but the editor, Gavin Green, who a great guy, ex-racing driver, Australian. He raced in Formula Ford in Australia, but then he moved to the UK and didn't race much anymore, just occasionally, but a very, very good driver and a very good editor, and now still a friend. And he and I began to talk about, can we have a little bit more motorsport content in Car Magazine? And we duly did. And I was able to write some of those stories and begin to go to the odd Grand Prix. I wasn't going to every Grand Prix in the year at that time, but going to a few and interviewing some of the drivers, obviously, and writing stories the way one does. And that carried on for a little while. And then Haymarket, which was then the publisher of Autosport and Motorsport News and various other things, they decided they wanted to do a monthly magazine about Formula One, because there wasn't one. And they headhunted me to be the editor. And that was called F1 Racing. And that was a wonderful time in my career. I was the editor of F1 Racing for 11 years between 1996 and 2007. Great time, wonderful times, working with brilliant colleagues, people like Peter Windsor, Ollie Peagam, Tom Clarkson, who will be well known, as would Peter, to motorsport fans who are listening to this potentially. Great photographers, Darren Heath, great graphic designers, Frank Foster, and various others. And I probably shouldn't name these people because I'll inevitably forget some of them. The late Alan Henry, brilliant guy. Anyway, I was very fortunate. And then I got to know various people in the sport because I began to go to every race, of course, in Formula One. And one of the people I got to know very well was Ron Dennis. And he finally offered me a job as Director of Communications. And I started on the 1st of January 2008.
That's brilliant. I mean, it just shows the power of what words of encouragement can do to a young professional. And I'm not just me. I think everybody here is very lucky that that you had this opportunity, because that brought you into our lives, and I think that's a great gift. And of course, your amazing pieces on tech and the brake steer and all that, and that's just, I'm really happy that this happened for you.
Thank you. That's very kind of you, I must say.
He's totally fanboying over you.
I'm wearing my Aston Martin Seb t-shirt right now.
Perfect.
If I had a Matt Bishop t-shirt, I'd wear that. Maybe maybe merch is in your future as well.
I can't imagine that. But anyway, I appreciate your kind comments.
So obviously, Matt, it's Pride Month, and many brands are taking the opportunity to express a message of inclusion, and we know that a lot of it is pinkwashing, and that we have still a long way to go in terms of broad acceptance. I'm particularly reminded of the recent backlash against drag queens and rampant transphobia. What do you think is the goal of F1 and the FIA in that regard? And what do you think is going to be the biggest obstacle or challenge that they're facing when it comes to making the paddock and race events safe and welcoming for all types of marginalized folk?
I think it's a good question. I think what's important, and it doesn't only apply to Formula One and motorsport, it applies to all walks of life, and certainly all sport, which is all sport, all walks of life, and certainly Formula One and motorsport should be open to everyone, and everyone therefore should feel welcomed as they begin to indulge their hobby. So if a LGBTQ plus person wants to go with their partner to a Grand Prix, a Formula One race, for instance, and hold their partner's hand in the grandstand, they ought to be able to do that without fear of any kind of negative response. If a man and a woman can hold hands, then anyone else can hold hands. And one of the things that I think Racing Pride, which I'm one of the people who founded in 2019 in association with Stonewall, great LGBTQ plus charity. One of the things that we do is we want to make sure that we lobby in the right way, teams, Formula One itself, the FIA, and so on, and every other stakeholder in motorsport, in order to help accelerate and facilitate that feeling of inclusion. And by the way, I've talked about fans, and in various places, LGBTQ plus fans feel more welcomed than in other places. So there's work to be done there. I think also within the teams, and indeed junior karting. I'm talking about teenagers really. If it so happens that the owner of a go-kart team is perhaps someone who hasn't really spent a lot of time thinking about LGBTQ plus issues, and says something unthinkingly, and I'm not blaming them, but unthinkingly inconsiderate, such as, "Listen, son, you drove really gay today." And you do sometimes hear that. One of the things that Racing Pride would like to say is, don't say that. Don't say that. Don't tell a youngster that gay can be an adjective synonymous with any other pejorative adjective. So that if you tell somebody you drove gay today, it's the same as saying you drove badly. It doesn't matter whether the youngster, even if the youngster is absolutely certain that he or she is heterosexual, they shouldn't be exposed to that kind of terminology being used in that kind of way. So we do that. And by the way, when we go and talk to such people, they're very welcoming. They say, "No, I hadn't thought of that. You're spot on." And that's one side of it. The other side of it is when we go into Formula One teams, and we at Racing Pride are now formally aligned and partnered with 3 out of 10 Formula One teams, I'm pleased to say, which is Aston Martin, Alpine, and Red Bull. Red Bull, we announced at the beginning of Pride Month this year, so just a few days ago, the 1st of June. And one of the things we do there is sometimes it might be a mechanic or an engineer, particularly those kind of positions, jobs within the teams where LGBTQ plus people feel a little bit marginalized and unaccepted, because traditionally those jobs have been done by heterosexual men. By the way, always white heterosexual men as well. Formula One is very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant type of thing, if you see what I mean, and heterosexual. So I think if we go into those teams and say, do you realize that you will have closeted mechanics, closeted engineers, people who are living in secret with that side of their life? But by the way, it may well be that they are married to their same-sex partner. It may well be that both families are fully aware and accepting. It may well be that their friends are fully aware and accepting. It may well be that their neighbors are fully aware and accepting. But you have a mechanic or an engineer who can only, who by the way, who can feel comfortable about who he is, because it's mostly males, but not only, but mostly, who can feel comfortable about who he is everywhere except at work. Now, surely you want to improve that anyway, because you want your employees to be happy, and it's the right thing to do. But secondly, if he is unhappy, and as I say, it's mostly men, so if you forgive me for using the pronoun he, just for this context of this answer, if he is unhappy, he's probably distracted from his work. He's probably more likely to make mistakes because all his engineer and mechanic colleagues are heterosexual and quite perhaps conservative and not progressive around some of their attitudes. So if you can get him to feel comfortable about coming out, by the way, you should never force anyone to come out, but if you can get to a situation where they feel comfortable about coming out, and if you have an authentic and constructive LGBTQ plus HR policy, then probably what will happen is that this unhappy engineer or mechanic will become happier. This distracted engineer or mechanic will become less distracted and therefore begin to make fewer mistakes and ultimately do better work. And you know what then will happen? Your car will go faster. So actually, if you have a good, robust, authentic and successful LGBTQ plus employment policy within a Formula One team, your car will go faster. And some people might doubt that and say that I'm talking pie in the sky. Fine, if that's your view, fine. But all I would say is that we spoke to Aston Martin, Alpine and Red Bull in that way, and they have said, yes, we understand that. And by the way, those teams aren't doing very badly at the moment, are they?
No, they're
Very
not.
badly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I haven't even considered the fact that, closeted LGBTQ plus folk are having to do this mental labor, invisible mental labor of being very cognizant of what, sorry about the pun, cognizant, but being very intentional about what they do express or not express, to not out themselves by accident, or to receive this backlash, this potential backlash. So
It's a
yeah,
worry. It's a worry for them. So if you can remove that,
yeah,
you can help them to do better work in a more constructive and progressive environment.
right. So what do you think? F1. What is the largest obstacle in front of F1, the organization? Of course, a couple of years ago they had We Racers One, which I think started with anti-racism messages, but of course was had all the colors of the rainbow. And ever since that, they've gone a bit silent on the matter, leaving the teams to advocate for themselves. But what do you think the organization itself, F1, can do, and what is facing in their way?
Formula One had hashtag We Racers One. The FIA had hashtag purpose driven, and both of them I think are commendable. Yes, I think they could probably both do more now, because there has been an element of going off the boil to some extent. So I agree with you there. But I'm, I don't think we should, be negative about it, because I think what one should do is advocate in a positive way. As you say, the teams, to some extent, are filling the breach anyway. Obviously, 3 teams, as I say, are formally partnered with Racing Pride, but all the teams now get involved in some way in terms of a diversity, equity, and inclusion program. The McLaren team does a lot with mental health, and that's something that Lando Norris has championed and supported. The Mercedes team does a lot with anti-racism, which obviously Lewis Hamilton has championed and supported. And all of these things are to be welcomed. I think the obstacles are, well, there's a degree. I mean, there are obviously people who are not progressive thinkers in all sectors of society and all walks of life. So there will be some fans who aren't particularly engaged with the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We see that. I mean, you see that on Twitter, don't you? Occasionally, you see that all over the place. But in general, I think that what is positive is that here we are in the month of June. It's a Pride month, and it's now become absolutely mainstream for corporates to embrace it. And in the sense that nobody thinks askance, or very few people think askance, if they log on to the Mercedes-Benz website and see that the three-pointed star has got rainbow colors for this month, or they walk down the high street and see that one of the high street shops has got a rainbow motif. I mean, some people may not like it, but overall, I think people are beginning to understand that it's normal, it's mainstream, and all it really means is let us allow everybody on this planet to be who they want to be and love whom they want to love. That's all it means. And it shouldn't be anything that gets anybody upset or horrified. So listen, I think there are still strides to be made. And, some of the countries that Formula One races in are behind the curve, let's put it that way. There are countries where Formula One races where, same-sex activity is illegal. And some where the punishments are extremely severe. But I think that's a challenge. But I think also if we embrace We Race as One, and if we embrace purpose-driven, and if we make it mean something, then I think we can say, yes, we're going to your country. We hope to put on a great race. We hope your citizens enjoy it. We hope the citizens of the world enjoy it and think that your country has hosted a great race. But we haven't checked in our principles and values at your airport, ready to be collected 5 days later when we go back home again. No, we will take them with us proudly into your cities and into your circuit. And we will say, yes, we do think that there are some aspects of the way your country is run that are suboptimal when it comes to human rights. And you knew who we were when you invited us. And don't be surprised that we will say respectfully and politely a few things about how we think there can be greater human rights in the world, including in your country. And I think that's totally polite. I think that's totally logical. And to be honest, I think it's something that the host nations of the kind that I'm talking about should expect, because they knew who we were before they invited us.
Right. And it's not even a big ask, I think.
No, I mean, I think it isn't. I think the world is moving slowly in the right direction. Perhaps somebody will say I'm being naive and that certain countries will never change in the way that I advocate and anticipate. And let's wait and see. I'm perfectly happy to admit I'm wrong if I'm wrong. But my own hope, aspiration, is that by doing the things I've just talked about and by taking the approach that I've just talked about, perhaps the needle can be moved slightly positively towards a more progressive and accepting culture in all countries, really, that Formula One visits. And that's something to be praised and welcomed.
I completely agree. And I think we mustn't stop trying. Circling back to your early days in F1, I think back in 1996, you've described yourself as the only gay in the F1 village. And you talked about having to make a certain effort to not come out in front of your peers who might be a little more conservative. I was wondering, how did that shape your day-to-day experience in the
I
paddock?
didn't. I didn't do that. That's not actually quite accurate. I did come out.
Oh,
I came out straight away, but
ah,
so I was the only gay in the village.
right.
When I arrived in Formula One, I did decide to come out. Now, I don't mean that I ran down the paddock, uh, yelling and screaming, and telling people, by the way, hello, Michael Schumacher. My name is Matt Bishop. By the way, I'm gay. I didn't do that. That would be eccentric then, and it would be eccentric now. But I never told a lie if asked about it. And
Right.
gradually it therefore became known that I was gay. And in that sense, I became the only gay in the village. I think I was the only gay in the village, the Formula One village, because others were closeted, others were hidden, others were fearful. And I don't know why I wasn't. I probably had some fear myself. I certainly experienced some homophobia at that time. And that it wasn't necessarily very easy, but I did decide to do that and to come out, and just because I didn't want to tell a lie anymore, or tell a lie at all. And everybody has to come out at some point, because let me say, when you work out, and whatever age it is, when you work out that perhaps you might be LGBTQ plus, whenever it is, whatever age, in some ways, the person who's most surprised about that is the person themselves, because they have all come from, or absolutely almost all come from the conjunction of man and woman, and have been born as the result of a heterosexual lovemaking act. And obviously, I'm saying something that's pretty obvious. And therefore, most people are brought up, and certainly in my day, because I'm 60 now, so I'm talking about a long time ago, people were brought up where, it was utterly accepted that the norm was being straight and anything else was not normal. And the person who makes the discovery themselves is that person in secret, perhaps in fear. And by the way, yes, there are, countries like the country I live in now, the UK, is more progressive and more accepting of LGBTQ plus people than it was when I was young. But there are other countries in the world where that change has not taken place, as you very well know. And I think growing up in the shadow of the fear that one might be LGBTQ plus is stressful and nasty and difficult for people in those countries. So everybody has that difficulty. But when you do come out, and if you get to an age where, and a level of confidence where you feel able to do so, then I think it's a wonderful thing to do. So I did come out in Formula One. I arrived in Formula One as the only gay in the Formula One village. And, I suppose one of the reasons why here I am now, all these years later, decades later, as, an ambassador for Racing Pride and on your podcast talking about this, is that I suppose I have become known for that as being, I used to be the only gay in the Formula One village. Now I'm the oldest gay in the Formula One village, and I suppose I'm known for both of those things. And I've never been particularly fearful. Well, I've never been cowed by what fear I had, or never been so cowed by it that I felt it was impossible to speak out. And people have been kind enough to say that seeing me in senior positions in Formula One teams, particularly McLaren and Aston Martin, and seeing me as a director of those teams, as a reasonably, high-profile person within the sport, has cheered them and empowered them and enabled them to feel good about being either aspiring to be in Formula One in one way or another, perhaps working in it, or being a fan. And there's a phrase, if you can see it, you can be it. And so I think it's great that increasingly we are now seeing more people in Formula One who don't feel the need to hide in that way.
I absolutely love that for you, and for anyone who's been inspired to be who they want to be, in the sport, right, or outside of it. and obviously, great thanks for that. And it's just so nice that you've been in such prominent roles, but not just prominent, also outward facing, so that you could get your word out. And as we know, you do have a way with words. I'd like to hear about your partnership with Sebastian Vettel, who's become a huge LGBTQ plus ally in the later stages of his career. Wanted to know how that came about, like you and him working together about these topics, and where do you see his advocacy going forward in his life after F1?
So when I worked with Seb, and I'd known him for years. I mean, I remember interviewing him before he was a Formula One driver, when he was a test driver for the BMW Sauber team back in the day. But anyway, that was many, many years ago. So by the time I worked with him full time, which was in 2021, I had arrived as a newcomer to the Aston Martin team, and he had arrived as a newcomer to the Aston Martin team. And, I knew him for many years. And when I sat down, I said, look, what kind of media work do you want to do? Because you have to do some. He said, well, okay, yes, I know I have to do some, but I'm a bit bored of it, really, to be honest with you. I said, well, you've got to do it. He said, yeah, I know. He said, look, I get bored of, the same questions, stuff like, why did you leave Ferrari? Or even just questions like, you were running fourth at the end of the race and dropped to sixth. Do you think you spent too long on the soft tire? That kind of thing. He said, look, I said, well, you will have to do some of that stuff. But the set piece stuff we can do with you can be much more interesting. What do you want to do? And so he started talking about his commitment and passion to and for the environment and the importance of highlighting the issues around climate change. He talked about human rights and the need to bring his views about human rights to the fore, including but not limited to LGBTQ plus issues. So, for instance, when he went to Saudi Arabia to race there, he did, and we organized with him, a go-karting event with teenage girls. Why? Because obviously we know that women's rights are not optimal in Saudi Arabia, and that adult women, have only recently been permitted to drive cars on the road. So teenage girls really don't do an awful lot of go-karting. That's very much a boys' thing. So we did a program where he, Seb Vettel, did go-karting with girls only. We did various other things. I remember him saying that he couldn't believe how litter strewn the roads from Heathrow Airport to the Aston Martin factory were. And so, immediately our ears pricked up and said, well, would you like to do something about that? He said, well, what would I do about that? So then we had the idea together where at the end of the British Grand Prix, despite having raced that afternoon for us, he would go with some of us and some fans, a small number of fans, and pick up litter in the grandstands that had been left by the spectators who had departed. And there was a ton of it. And he did it. And some people thought he would do 5 minutes for the cameras only, but he absolutely didn't. He picked up a ton of litter. And then afterwards, he went on the dump truck to the recycling center depot to see what happened and how the bottles and the cans and the plastic and so on was separated, to see whether it was properly dealt with in that way and processed. And that's Seb. Seb is, he's a person who I suppose I have seen in the sport go from boy to man. He arrived when he was 19. He left when he was 35. We all go on a rites of passage between 19 and 35, and he's no different. He arrived as a teenager and he's left as a man in his mid-30s, married to a woman with 3 children, and yet an absolutely passionate advocate for human rights, including LGBTQ plus rights. And it was a pleasure to work with him. And I'm pleased to say that the work we did with him won an award, a comms award, a PR award. It won the Race website's Most Inspiring Campaign award, which I was delighted to go up and accept or in their awards ceremony at the beginning of this year, but it reflected the work we did in the previous year. Seb is a great guy. What is he going to do going forward? Well, I think he's had some time off. He doesn't need money, so he doesn't need to earn money at the moment or ever. And I think he wanted to enjoy quality time with his wife and kids. And now he's begun to appear. He's going to appear at Goodwood this year. He's got involved in a sailing team, as perhaps you've seen. And I wouldn't be too surprised to see him getting involved in other initiatives. I don't know what he'll end up doing. I don't even think he knows exactly what he'll end up doing. But I'm sure he'll end up doing something valuable and beneficial, if I may say something so grandiose, to humankind. And by the way, while I'm saying this, another driver who, of course, I've worked with in the past, albeit when he was a young man, is Lewis Hamilton. I worked with him when he was 23. He's now 38. And he, too, has gone on the same kind of journey as Seb Vettel has. And, you will see Lewis, who, again, is a straight man. So both of them are what we call allies, people who are not LGBTQ+, nonetheless want to positively support and represent the rights and interests of LGBTQ+ people everywhere. You will see Lewis doing that, and Lewis becoming an increasingly vocal, fearless, and powerful person in sport. And when he hangs up his helmet, and I don't know when that will be, but when he does, I think what he next does will also be fascinating. And I'm incredibly lucky to have worked with 4 world champions, because I worked with Fernando Alonso and Jenson Button, as well as Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton. But certainly Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton, I think, brilliant drivers on track, brilliant drivers off track, and brilliant people, I think, we're going to see in their post-Formula One phase.
I'm personally very excited to see what Lewis continues to do after his retirement, which I hope is not soon, of course. It's great stories. I do remember litter picking Seb, as well as many other jobs that F1 Reddit and F1 Twitter has given him, like Fire Marshal Seb and Medical Car Seb and all that stuff. So it's really cool to see that you were also part behind of those initiatives, and I just really love that. Lastly, before we continue to our lightning round, I'd like to touch on W Series, which was a single-seater championship for women, and you were, of course, part of its founding members. And from the get-go, W Series had openly queer representation with drivers such as Jessica Hawkins, which also was in Aston Martin, Abby Eaton, and Sarah Moore. Do you think it's sort of easier to have a message of LGBTQ plus rights when you have women at the forefront? And what can F1 learn from what W Series did in that regard?
I loved working at W Series. I was, yes, one of the founding team. It was David Coulthard, who was one of the founders, who got me involved and said, "Do you want to come and help us?" And I said, "Yes, I think I will. I think it sounds a fascinating thing." And in fact, in the first year, there was one lesbian driver, which was Sarah Moore. But then in the following years, Abby Eaton joined. And in fact, she befriended Jessica Hawkins, who'd been a driver from the outset at W Series. And if you may say so, love blossomed in W Series, because, of course, Jessica Hawkins and Abby Eaton became a couple. And so there ended up being 3 LGBTQ plus drivers at W Series. Anyway, I think in general, female sports stars have been more widely accepted to be LGBTQ plus. For instance, for many years, we've seen female tennis players, not only playing tennis but winning, whether it was Martina Navratilova or Billie Jean King or any of the others. And I think that's something that's become quite widespread. We now see, with the rise of women's football, which of course a few years ago was a very minority interest, but now, for instance, the Lionesses, the female England football team, they pack out Wembley Stadium. They could fill it 3 times over, and a number of members of that team are LGBTQ+. So I think there may be more of them in the first place, but also they feel more able to come out. I think that the door is ready to be pushed open. We've had the first English Premier League male footballer come out as a gay man, and the sky didn't fall on his head. Nothing terrible happened, and in fact he was widely welcomed and praised in mainstream media for having done that. What I would like to see, I suppose, and by the way, currently I certainly believe it's the case that the 20 current Formula One drivers are all heterosexual. That's certainly how they present themselves, and I have no reason to think that any of them are not. But at some point, perhaps somebody who is now in Formula 4 or Formula 3 or Formula 2, and I'm not thinking of anyone specific, I have no knowledge of anyone of this nature, but I'm thinking that at some point a gay man may come forward. And if that gay man ended up coming forward and racing and winning in Formula 1, then I think the world would be ready for it and embrace it. And I think it would be a very powerful thing. And I think indeed the sponsors would welcome it. And I think the fans would welcome it. There would be some that didn't. But by and large, I think they would. I think that the door is ready to be pushed open. I think it might spring open, and in a positive and exciting way. So let's wait and see if, when, or if that happens. But I certainly think it's something that we will one day see, and when we do see it, then it will have the organic drip down effect, of course, of making other people, including young people, decide, well, maybe I want to be a Formula One driver. Maybe I can be, because look at him. He's gay and he's winning in Formula One. So why can't I? And we go back to the phrase I used earlier. If you can see it, you can be it.
I totally agree. And I do truly believe that we can see this in our lifetime. And and I also agree that if one can come out, then greater numbers will follow. Such a change also happened in hip hop, like with gay male rappers, in this musical genre that was, traditionally very straight, very even misogynistic, and the landscape is changing.
Yes, I think it's a good example.
Yeah, so I think we've come to our lightning round. It's just a few rapid fire questions, and again, you can feel free to expand as much as you like.
I won't expand too much because people must be getting bored of this by now. We're coming up towards the hour, so I'll answer rapid fire as you suggest.
I highly doubt that they'll be bored. I think this is the first time I'm going to disagree with you on this podcast. So you're a tech nerd, an F1 tech nerd. What is your favorite F1 innovation that you think needs to be brought back?
Well, if it was the first part of your question was the favorite innovation, and I was going to say ground effect, and I was particularly going to say the Lotus cars of the late 70s. The Lotus 78 wing car of 1977 and the Lotus 79 ground effect car of 1978. But there is ground effect now back in Formula One, so that wouldn't count if you want me to come up with the innovation that must be brought back. I suppose if it didn't have the stipulation that it must be one that must be brought back, I would have liked that. First of all, I thought that those cars were absolutely beautiful, with the long, sleek side pods. I think the Lotus 79, which obviously Mario Andretti drove to World Championship success in 1978, one of the most beautiful cars in the history of motorsport, helped, I must say, by its black and gold livery. Although the cars looked beautiful the following year in green martini colours as well. But never mind. Yes, so that was a great innovation for me, but an innovation that is no longer allowed. Let me think. Okay, I'm going to say something. It's an odd. It's a purely aesthetic request. The very high, tall airboxes of the Formula One cars of the early and mid 70s. In fact, they came to an end. The last time we saw them was at Long Beach in 1976. Was the third race of that year. So we saw them at Brazil, South Africa, and Long Beach in 76. And then when the Formula One circus arrived in the European season for Spain, Belgium, Monaco, and so on, they were reduced. But I loved those high airboxes. I thought they looked aggressive and beautiful in a rather brutal way. Particularly some of the larger ones. For instance, the Ligier JS5, which was nicknamed the Teapot. And by the way, anyone who's listening, if you're not as old as me, and of course most people who are listening won't be as old as me because hardly anybody is as old as me, but do Google Ligier, Ligier, JS5 Teapot 1976, and you'll see what I mean.
All right. Our next question is a cleaner take on a very popular game. This one's called Taxi, Dinner and Dishes. You have to choose one driver to take you to dinner, just drive you to dinner, one driver that you're going to have the dinner with, and another driver you're going to send back into the kitchen to do the dishes so that you don't have to look at him all night long. Who would those drivers be?
Well, I'll tell you who I would. Let me work it out. So to drive me to dinner, I'd say Ayrton Senna, because to be driven by Ayrton Senna, which I haven't been, of course, but to be driven by Ayrton Senna would be a great thing to be able to say one had done. I'd want him to drive me there quickly, though. Otherwise, there's no point. So
I don't think there's a way that he wouldn't do that.
No, but I not on public roads. So what I'd say is we need to have. We'll be eating at the Nürburgring, and you have to do a lap of it with me next to you, and then we'll get out, and then you can drop me at the restaurant.
So that's how. It's also like a long taxi ride.
I'm cheating, but that's my request.
Perfect.
Then to have dinner with the driver to have dinner with. Well, of all the current drivers, the one that I know the very, very best, because there's a lot of drivers that I would say I'm friendly with, but that's not the same as being a friend of, a real friend of. But there's one driver that I would say I'm a real friend of, still on the grid of 20. I mean, he came to my wedding, my husband's and our wedding. He's been often to our house, and I've met him and his wife, and that is Kevin Magnussen. And I worked with him, of course, at McLaren when he was a part of the Young Driver Development Program there. And then when he became a race driver there, I worked in very, very closely with him. And I would regard him as a very good friend. But I mean, I love having dinner with him, and I've had 100 dinners with him. So it's not really a wish list, but I haven't had dinner with him for a little while. So yes, I'm going to choose Kev Magnussen.
Awesome. And who would you choose to send to the kitchen to do the dishes?
The trouble with saying this is that you just get a pile on social media from their fans.
Right.
That's to be honest with you, I'm just not going to answer, because if I do that, I will have to take a holiday from Twitter.
That's fair,
for another 2 months while the furore dies down of me having insulted a driver. And anyway, I don't dislike any of the drivers, to be fair.
All right, fair. That's fair. I'm not going to push you on that one. Next question. Name a person from the LGBTQ plus community that you would like to see wave the checkered flag, and at which race that would be.
Tom Daley, Saudi Arabia.
Why Tom Daley?
Tom Daley obviously came out as a gay man a few years ago. He came out in his own YouTube video, and it was quite an emotional video. You could see he was struggling and with courage to come out, but he did. And since then, he's become an absolute household name in the UK, a national treasure even, and absolutely loved and cherished in this country. But the key thing, I think, is that as a result of him having come out, and I'm going to go back to the phrase, if you can see it, you can be it. And I think young gay men in particular, but LGBTQ plus people in general, saw Tom Daley, globally top class successful sports person, and thought, I can see it, I can be it. And I think men's diving particularly has now attracted more LGBTQ plus people who felt, yeah, I can do that. I'm sporty. I like my sport. I'm good at PE at school. I'm good at all these things. Let me have a go at this sport because it's obviously one that welcomes people like me. And when Tom Daley recently won an Olympic gold medal, I thought his speech was beautiful. He said, and I'm paraphrasing now, but it's pretty close to this. He said, I am an Olympic gold medal champion and a gay man. And I never thought I'd be able to say those words because I always thought, even though I was quite good at diving and I was practicing when I was younger and so on, I always thought that there was something about me that would preclude me from reaching the very top. But here I am. And if anybody who is watching can be inspired by my journey, that would make me very happy. So I would love to see Tom Daley waving the flag, and I'd love to see it happen in Saudi Arabia, but it wouldn't, for obvious reasons. They wouldn't want him to do it, and actually he wouldn't want to do it because I think, having read a lot of interviews with him and so on, he is of the view that countries like that should not be embraced by Western sports. So let's settle for Monaco. We'll settle for Monaco.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And of course, if that change can happen in Saudi Arabia, hopefully in our lifetimes, that would be brilliant. But of course, all the caveats. Final question from me, and this is on behalf of Georgie. Pineapple on pizza. Do you love it? Do you hate it?
It's not for me. I love pizza and I love pineapple, but not on the same plate, I'm afraid. By the way, why is it called Hawaiian? Is that what they eat in Hawaii? Pizza with pineapple? I didn't know that. I've never been to Hawaii.
I don't know.
But I gather in England, if you you go to a Pizza Hut or a Pizza Express and ask for a Hawaiian, you get pineapple on your pizza. No, personally not. I love pizza, but I like an American hot with a lot of chilies and so on, with perhaps a bit of Tabasco thrown over the top of it.
Oh.
But I would just like pineapple, a fresh pineapple, freshly cut, nothing better.
I'm very happy that the final thing that you said on this podcast was the fact that you love hot sauces and spices. As a hothead myself, well, this is the end of our podcast, and if you want to have the final word, the floor is yours. Like a message to our listeners, upcoming projects, and where can our listeners find you?
It's very kind of you. So listeners can find me on Twitter if they want to, which is @thebishf1. And they can find me on motorsportmagazine.com, where I do a weekly column, which comes out on Tuesday mornings, UK time. So that's where they can find me by and large. I've talked a lot about what I've done and what I'm doing. So I'm just going to say two more things, if I may. Sometimes people ask me, do you have mottos? Do you have maxims? And I'm going to say two that I do have. One is live and let live. And think about those 4 words. Live, that means actually do your best. Live your best life. Be your best you. Enjoy yourself. Work hard. Love and be loved. Do all those things. Work hard. Achieve. try to be nice to each other. All those things that can be enshrined in the word live. And the next 3 words of it, and let live, let others do the same. Allow them to do the same. Welcome their differences. Celebrate the fact that they're not all like yourself. Live and let live. By the way, I've said this before. It's something that I have tried to live by myself. And the second one is, if in doubt, say yes. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, it doesn't mean you should say yes to every suggestion. If someone suggests something that's foolish, perhaps criminal, or very unwise, obviously you shouldn't say yes to it. But by the way, you shouldn't be any doubt. You shouldn't be in any doubt. If someone asks you to do a crime, you shouldn't be in any doubt. Your answer should be no. But if you're in genuine doubt, if in doubt, say yes, then my advice is to say yes. Because if you go through your life from 0 to 80 years old, or however long you're granted on this planet, if you go on that journey, if you go through that life timidly saying no all the time, yes, some of those answers will be correct and wise and judicious, and you will have a certain kind of life. But if you say yes all the time, and I'm only talking about when you're in doubt, I'm not talking about saying yes to stupid things, but if you say yes all the time, you may make the odd mistake, but overall, in my view, you will probably end up having a better life, a happier life. So those are my 2 phrases.
I love that. And I think particularly on the second one, I think the more you say yes to things and, get a feel of those experiences that you would have normally said no to, you'd know yourself better, and that would remove doubt in the next time.
I hope so.
Yeah. Matt Bishop, thank you so much for coming on the pod. This has been a brilliant talk, and I hope our listeners can take your advice. That's it for Stripping the Dipping. That was the legendary Matt Bishop.